Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. Welcome. I'm glad you can join us for our Unconscious Bias series, Unveiling Racism, and tonight it's going to be a virtual panel discussion on anti-Semitism. Our moderator for tonight will be Carin Savel, and she is the Executive Director of the Jewish Federation of Eastern Connecticut. Prior to joining them, she was the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Raleigh-Cary and led the Jewish Relations Committee of the Jewish Federation of Western Massachusetts. Before joining the Jewish professional world, Carin served for 12 years as Chief of Staff and Policy Director in the North Carolina General Assembly. Wow, you've got a lot of experience. Well, thank you for joining us tonight, Carin.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's a pleasure to be here. I borrowed a little bit from Steve Ginsburg's site, and we'll talk a little bit about this. On July 10th, 1933, nearly a decade before the Holocaust, Dr. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda, was on the front page, the front cover of Time magazine, stating, "The Jews are to blame." The anti-Semitic myths about power, loyalty, greed, blood libel, Holocaust denial, and anti-Zionism have persisted over time. Today, conspiracy theories abound that Jews created the coronavirus all throughout social media. And tonight, we're going to talk about how to recognize anti-Semitism, what it is, and what we can do about it. You may at any time post your questions or comments in the chat box for tonight. So let's begin with an introduction of our panel. Steve Ginsburg is here tonight. Since 2015, Steve Ginsburg has served as the Executive Director of the Anti-Defamation League, that's the ADL, in the Connecticut region. He is the leading voice in the fight against hate and bigotry. Steve leads ADL's efforts to monitor and expose extremist groups, educate about bias and bullying, and advocate for justice and civil rights. Steve directs ADL's work with law enforcement and community partners to prevent and respond to hate crimes and to build bridges of understanding. Also with us tonight is Stephanie Hausner. Stephanie is the interim director of the Israel Action Network and is responsible for strengthening capacity of local community professionals in countering the assault on Israel's legitimacy. Stephanie came to the IAN after working in the federation system in various capacities. A former councilwoman herself, Stephanie was named one of Rockland County's 40 under 40 and was included in the Jewish Week 36 under 36. And finally tonight is Avi Weinryb. Avi is the Deputy Director of the Combat Anti-Semitism Movement, that's CAM, a nonpartisan global grassroots movement that fights anti-Semitism wherever it occurs. He has over a decade of professional experience in advocacy and public affairs. Prior to joining CAM, Avi was the Director of National Strategy at the JFNA's Israel Action Network, where he helped form several national projects, including Academic Partners for Peace. So let's begin. We do have some questions for the panel, but once again, please feel free to enter your own questions in the chat box and join into the conversation. So Steve, I'm going to start with you, but the question is really to all the panelists. Let's talk about the need for making the true definition of anti-Semitism stick. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance defines it as anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Is social media our friend in this? Is this what's going on? Is social media our enemy in combating the conspiracy theories and misunderstandings? How do we make this definition stick?
Thanks, Carin. Thanks, everybody. So it's a great question. And, you know, at ADL, we take a lot of care with the words that we use, the language that we choose, and the ideas that we promote, and those that we defend, and our voice is a key element of that. But when it comes to defining a concept like anti-Semitism, you know, I guess it's a concept that's existed for millennia, and these recent efforts to sort of come to some international consensus around it are very powerful. We think very important and very constructive, but it's an idea that is hard to grasp. And I think, we have found there's the definition from the Holocaust Remembrance Act to be a powerful tool to get people at least talking about the same topic. Because for many people, and probably many people on this call, anti-Semitism might be an idea they know something about, but they don't know a ton about. It gives us sort of a frame of reference. And what I can say is, we have seen the efforts through the State Department and on an international stage to sort of get people to understand how the Jewish people feel about anti-Semitism is incredibly important. Just as I would really hesitate before telling a person of color, a Black person, what racism is. I think it is important or a Muslim person, what Islamophobia is, or what a member of the LGBTQ community, what homophobia is. I think it's important that we define these things and talk to those impacted by these concepts as we define them. The question about social media is, obviously you asked it the right way. It probably has helped spread the people share this idea that we can come to an understanding of what anti-Semitism is, but it definitely has been a destructive force with respect to the spread of anti-Semitism. The internet, social media, cyber hate is flourishing, conspiracy theories spreading like faster than we can even understand them. And often because of the construct of anti-Semitism, because it's composed of these age-old tropes and because it can be twisted, it's made it very easy to point out anti-Semitism or call something it's made it easy for people to promote anti-Semitic ideas in a very harmful way. I think for now, I would say that social media has been definitely a net negative on the spread of anti-Semitism.
Okay, Stephanie?
So I agree with Steve in terms of the net negative piece, and I'll spend a few minutes on the IRA definition first and then also address the second part. We are part of, actually, let me go back. So the Israel Action Network is part of the Jewish Federations of North America, and we also are in partnership with the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which serves as an umbrella organization for Jewish community relations councils, which generally are part of federations, not always, and also have a group of partner national organizations, member organizations. I mentioned this because last year, or actually this year, it just seems like last year, in February at their national convention, we helped write, and colleagues from ADL and AJC, as well as several federations were involved in this, in drafting a resolution to adopt the IRA definition as an educational tool in our work. And I think just to add on to Steve's point, that since there's so much confusion about anti-Semitism, the role Israel plays in anti-Semitism or not, we feel like using the IRA definition and the examples, because this is—
Give me a minute to try to work on mine, and then you can do it.
Okay, so using the IRA definitions and the examples, there are many examples that they put forth included with the definition, and the examples help explain what that means, right? In which circumstances might this definition be used? And so we think that education, using it as an educational tool, adoption is important so that we can all be consistent in language around anti-Semitism. Too often, and Steve made this point, but too often over the last few years, we've seen other groups try to define anti-Semitism for us as a Jewish community, for us as larger communal Jewish organizations. And so we feel like this is important right now to make a push around a common definition so that we can speak with one voice on this issue. In terms of social media, we saw a few weeks ago, although time, I think in this world we live in now is sometimes a blur, that Facebook announced a change in Holocaust denial, on Facebook. There had for years really been Holocaust denial sites, pages, individuals, and what I think, and this was ADL was involved in this, AJC others, a conference of presidents of American Jewish organizations, Canadian groups as well. But what we saw ultimately, I think, played a large impact was Holocaust survivors had to go on Facebook and talk to Facebook and say, we lived through this, right? We know that the Holocaust existed, right? And I'm not trying to, there was a lot of advocacy work that took place. But right now you could go on TikTok and see people reenacting the Holocaust, right? These things are happening. There's no regulation around much of social media. Social media, large conglomerates have been very slow to take action against this. And so we're now seeing, even in the last few days, really, a migration of people from Facebook or Twitter to other sites like Parler or I'm drawing a blank on the name. But, you know, so how this plays out and how people and thoughts that have long been in the shadows of the American political system and political discourse are now using social media as a tool to really put these ideas out there. And we saw earlier this summer, Louis Farrakhan memes of anti-Semitic statements being used on Instagram by people who probably didn't have anti-Semitic intentions, but with a clear lack of understanding of where these were coming from. And I'm sure we'll get to that a little bit later, but I wanted to use it as an example.
Thank you, Stephanie. Hi, Avi.
Hey, everyone. Yeah, I'll start with the social media aspect and then jump to the IRA part. Try to avoid echoing a lot of the sentiments that I agree with that my colleagues just said. So social media, like any medium, is a double-edged sword. It can really cut both ways. You know, our team over at Combat Anti-Semitism Movement, as well as so many other Jewish organizations, have been in dialogue recently with policy teams at Facebook and Twitter, among others. And the approach toward anti-Semitism, while improving, is still somewhat lacking. Although, as Stephanie mentioned, there was that positive breakthrough with Facebook and Holocaust denial. But we've seen that, you know, misinformation about COVID-19 or elections will be flagged because it does public harm. With Holocaust denial, up until very recently, and still an issue, it's not. So, you know, contemporary anti-Semitism takes many forms, and it can be very subtle sometimes. So using euphemisms to refer to Jews, and a lot of that will kind of slip through and can't be addressed when one reports it because they're euphemisms and it's unclear, and there's, of course, free speech issues. So it'll often get a pass on many platforms. So there's a lot of issues there. And of course, there's also the whole other aspect of the use of social media and private messages for organizing among hate groups. So yeah, my team and I were, you know, huge supporters of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. We recently held some events around it. We really believe that one cannot address a problem without first defining it, and having consensus about what is and isn't anti-Semitic means protections can actually be enforced, thereby protecting Jewish communities. So at this point right now, I think there's about 30 countries around the world that have formally adopted it, most recently Albania, just the other week. And many other organizations, municipalities, other folks are taking it on. We've seen a trend recently where a few have been trying to divorce the definition from some of the examples. There's 11 examples, as others alluded to, related to contemporary anti-Semitism, kind of outline the various manifestations. And these are also, of course, very important. So, you know, we're hoping that the definition can continue to spread, and hopefully it'll reach a point where it'll offer this enforceability that'll really help protect people.
Thanks, Avi. So Stephanie, I want to ask the second question, starting with you, with the understanding that this is not primarily a Jewish event. This is an event for everybody. And nobody wants to be called an anti-Semite. But there is a prevailing theory that those who claim they don't hate Jews are actually looking to redefine what Jewish hatred looks like. And the data shows that the spaces where the definition of anti-Semitism is challenged are actually the most dangerous for Jewish safety. How do we actually know anti-Semitism when we see it? And how should it be addressed person to person? And how can people respond to incidences? We talked a little bit about social media, but what about in real life?
That's a great question. And I think we often have to take away the, sometimes people are quick to say someone's an anti-Semite. And I think that that's very unfortunate because I think most people in this world and most people in the United States are not anti-Semites. I think occasionally, and I think we've seen of late, that sometimes people make anti-Semitic comments. And so we have to address the comments that people are making and try to educate in relationship to those comments. And so one of the challenges we faced, and I mentioned before, people trying to define anti-Semitism for the Jewish community. There are also some more fringe groups within the Jewish community that are trying to define anti-Semitism for the rest of the community. And so I think that's a challenge, and certainly a challenge, I think, outside the Jewish community, in that we have a lot of Jewish organizations, and it's hard to kind of keep track of who's speaking for who, which is why I think, to Avi's point, like adopting in a large way makes sense. But one of the things that we've seen, and I'll go back to my Instagram example from before, and then also actually I'll use a real life example. We've seen on college campuses a few times over the last few years, and I'll point to one university, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Maybe we have an alumni on this call, but I didn't pick a Connecticut school on purpose. And at that school, which has really been a hotbed of anti-Semitic and BDS activity, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement over the last 5 years, we've seen administrators take Jewish students off of student government committees because they were Jewish and might have had implicit bias. We saw students, really, I was actually watching a student Senate debate in which student government officials said, you can't participate. We want Jewish students, but we don't want Zionists. And so they're basically trying to divorce people's support for the state of Israel with their Jewish identity, which for most Jews, support for the state of Israel, it's core to our Jewish beliefs. It is, and any of you who are well versed in the Bible, we were just reading actually, or we're reading this Shabbat in synagogue Hayei Sarah, which is when Abraham buys a plot of land to bury Sarah, right? It's the first Jewish ownership in the land of Israel. And so there's a clear connection with the land, with the people, and there are efforts to divide those. And so one of the things we see is people say, I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm just anti-Israel. And trying to unpack, and Avi said before, like using the code word. We see sometimes anti-Semitic tropes and conspiracy theories, right? Jews control Wall Street, Jews control the media. And so instead, of late, we've seen Zionists control the media, Zionists control Wall Street. And so unpacking with an individual what it is that they're trying to say. We've seen some city council officials, all over the country, and different individuals in leadership positions make a statement that they don't view as anti-Semitic. And so what we have a responsibility to do as a Jewish community is to try to educate, because in many cases, it might not be coming from a bad place, but we have to be able to have that conversation and see where the root of what they're saying comes from. And I think that that's a way that we can move this forward. I mean, we face right now anti-Semitism from the left, from the right, from really many different sides, but being able to try to have dialogue and conversation and talk about what it means to you or what it means to us as Jews when these phrases or these things are said, when the coronavirus is called a Jewish conspiracy theory, when we're blamed for different things, and why that might be a triggering thing, right? I said to someone that the word genocide, when referring, right, is a triggering word for Jewish community people, right? We remember the Holocaust, even if we, right, I'm a millennial, I don't remember the Holocaust, but I remember the Holocaust because it has been ingrained in me as a Jewish individual from my parents and grandparents and teachers and rabbis. And so using trigger words, I think in any group, but to be cognizant of what they are in the Jewish community.
Thanks, Stephanie. Steve, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. I'm trying to think of what I want to be sort of also responsive to what Stephanie added. So, from the ADL perspective, we're here on the ground sort of responding to incidents of anti-Semitism. And we have this larger organization that's monitoring and taking the pulse of what anti-Semitism looks like around the country and globally. We do surveys, we've done them for decades about anti-Semitism. And what I can tell you is, I think we released our most recent survey about anti-Semitic attitudes last year. It's hovering in the US about 10 or 15% of Americans have what we would call strong anti-Semitic beliefs, someone you would label an anti-Semite. While that's, 30 million people, it's not an overwhelming number of Americans with respect to the population. We also do global studies of this stuff, and we've surveyed over 100 countries. There are plenty worse countries in Europe and the Middle East. Our country, the United States, has been a real, possibly the best experience for the Jewish people ever. And we're still feeling very, American Jews feel very part of American society. We don't feel by and large, like the other. But there are moments, and there have been times in the last several years where things have felt very different. So we also measure incidents, and that's what I do here in Connecticut, is respond to those, and we track them. The incident numbers have gone way up, the number of reported incidents of anti-Semitism. And those, like Stephanie said, can look very different. Like sometimes it's an expletive in graffiti at a school in Connecticut, or a bullying incident at a school in Connecticut. And sometimes it's a politician saying something or posting something that they might not have thought was anti-Semitic, but tied into, Jews and the control of money, or Jews and power. And we've seen those things around the country and here. So it's a time where we're trying to make sense of, what the real temperature is and figure out what the responses are. What we know is that everybody is coming at this from a different perspective. You handle a 12-year-old kid who used a anti-Semitic word in school very differently than you do a white supremacist who's actively trying to plan an attack on the Jewish community, right? It's a very, very different analysis. So I'm trying to come back to the question, Carin. I mean, what I want to just communicate is that right now in America, anti-Semitism it's worse than it was recently, but America is still a place where we have a great deal of support. And when there are these incidents, people rally to our cause, and we have, and it's important also as the Jewish community for people to, I think, rally to the cause of other people who are also suffering from similar types of attacks. So I don't know, I'm resisting labels. I'm resisting the word anti-Semite, and maybe we can throw it to Avi, because I know that Natan Sharansky is part of his organization. But there's kind of a test, an old test that I know that about when criticism of Israel or if something becomes anti-Semitic as opposed to legitimate criticism of Israel. And it's the 3 Ds. Avi, you want to do it, or you want me to do the 3 Ds?
Well, we're going to get to that, Steve. We're going to get to that
Get
in a
to it
little
later.
bit.
All right, we'll get to it later.
Where we
Okay,
are. Yeah, Avi,
okay.
there's a question in the chat box, if you don't mind addressing, and this pretty much goes on to what we were just talking about, is how do you know anti-Semitism when you see it? And the question is, are conspiracy theories like lizard people control the world and the government and Pizzagate be considered anti-Semitic, even though they don't directly focus on Jewish people?
Oh. Yeah, no, I'd say, if a conspiracy theory doesn't specifically refer to Jewish people, right? I'm not on mute. Yeah. A lot of those are coming from or at least the lizard people one, somewhat, the Pizzagate one, you know, the QAnon. I know we have another question related to
We do.
that ties in with that. But you know, if you're targeting Jews, it's anti-Semitic. If you're really not, but it's adjacent to it, or it comes from that same body of thought, which does, you know, then it's interrelated. I really, you know, the Pizzagate thing. I mean, the QAnon, there's a lot of anti-Semitic tropes that are drawn up within that sphere, and then there's also conspiracy theories that very much overlap with very classical anti-Semitic conspiracy theories as well. Very much the Pizzagate one, which is alluding to you know, harming children, which goes all the way back to like medieval anti-Semitism. So yeah, it's interrelated, but it really depends on who's spouting it. I mean, context is always key. But just to, I think, you know, Steve made mention in his very opening comment that really speaks well to this, which is the idea that, you know, Jews seem to really be the only minority for which, I think Stephanie might have touched on this too, but the only minority for which it seems to be socially and politically acceptable for an outside group to come in and define or redefine what is or isn't discriminatory against that group. And you know, I know Steve mentioned, you know, if I were to tell a Black person that their understanding of racism is wrong, that wouldn't fly. And you know, if I were to tell a gay person what they thought was homophobic behavior was actually not, that wouldn't fly. But somehow when it comes to Jews, there seems to be this double standard, one of the 3 Ds of Sharansky. And it seems to be okay to define their oppression based on one's own beliefs rather than what normative mainstream Jewish voices are actually saying. And so there's this real cognitive dissonance happening. It's been happening for a long time. It's very much happening now. And it's malicious and harmful. And it kind of runs as an undercurrent through a lot of discourse, whether it's on campus or elsewhere. It's a problem.
Okay, thanks, Avi. Stephanie, to you, and you started to touch on this, and we'll get to the second question in the chat box in a minute. You started to touch on this, but I'm wondering if you wouldn't expound. The world holds Israel to standards no other countries are ever being held to. Comparing Israel to Nazis, discriminating against it in multinational forums, boycotting it on campus and academic institutions, and holding Jews collectively responsible for Israeli government actions are just some examples. And you will talk a little bit about BDS, if that's okay with you, and explain exactly what it is and where it's going. But is applying this double standard anti-Zionist, you know, anti-Israel, or is it anti-Semitic, anti-Jew? Is anti-Zionism actually anti-Semitism? And when should and shouldn't we apply the A word?
Okay, wow, that's a lot. We'll start, I'm gonna start then with the 3 Ds. So then we'll get that out of the way and then we'll go a little deeper. So the 3 Ds are double standard, delegitimization, and demonization. So if in your criticism of the state of Israel, right, you're employing one of those 3 Ds, if you're holding, to Karen's point, if you're holding Israel to a standard that you're not holding any other country in the world, if you're accepting an act, I'll just use the United Nations as an example, it's in some ways the gift that keeps on giving. Today, they called Israel out for human health abuses or human rights health abuses because of the coronavirus, right? And my initial reaction was, are they also calling out the United States for those coronavirus health abuses, right? And thinking about how we're holding up one country. The BDS campaign boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. And I should just say that the tools of boycotts, divestments, and sanctions are ones that the Jewish community has employed over times and are social movements and economic tools that we know are effective in some cases. But the BDS movement is part of a global campaign to demonize Israel to a point where it no longer exists as a Jewish democratic state. To delegitimize Israel to the point where it is completely isolated economically, socially, politically, culturally, and that's the goal of the BDS movement. Now, just to say, that doesn't mean that a student who might go to a BDS meeting on a college campus doesn't think the state of Israel should exist. And so the ADL actually did some great research on this a couple of years ago, I believe, in which they, with the Rayut Institute, in which they talked about the different types of BDS supporters. And so you have your hardcore criticizers, people who don't think Israel should exist. And not that we like to compare Israel to other countries, right? But the fact that we're actually having a debate in 2020, right, 70 plus years since the beginning of the state of Israel's existence, or the modern state of Israel's existence, whether or not it should even exist is not something that we have with any other country, right? So that's already kind of, that's one of the D's, right? Is why are we even questioning whether it has a right to exist? And I think that's where we're starting to see a lot of challenge. We've seen it over the last several years. There are cultural boycotts. Avi has a lot of expertise in talking about academic boycotts of Israel, which really say that university professors in the United States should not engage in academic activities with their counterparts in Israel, whether they're Jewish, Arab, it doesn't matter. Just they're isolating Israel in that particular space. So we've seen the BDS movement, right? If the leaders of the BDS movement are calling for a place without a Jewish state, that is anti-Semitic, right? If someone is saying, I don't like the practices of the Israeli government, and so I'm going to individually engage in a boycott of some Israeli companies, right? That's there from an American perspective. An individual boycott of any companies is a right that people have, right? And so I wouldn't say that person is anti-Semitic, but I think we need to think about where the line is and how dangerous people getting involved in a movement like this, which has fairly anti-Semitic goals, can be. And so we try to differentiate often the leaders of the BDS movement with people who are, for sure, with people who are criticizing Israel. It's totally appropriate. Israelis criticize Israel. One of my colleagues said the other day, we should think about, and the Israeli Knesset floor is much rougher actually than the United States Congress, but things that people that could say to each other on the Israeli Knesset floor shouldn't be viewed as anti-Semitic, right? And so thinking about that in terms of like lots of criticism of Israel is perfectly acceptable and maybe anti-Israel, not anti-Semitic. But when we go over those 3D line, or calling out Israel in a way that we wouldn't call out another country, or we're using the word Israel as a replacement for the word Jew, or the word Zionist as a replacement for the word Jew in a anti-Semitic trope, that's anti-Semitic. And so, I used before Zionists controlling Wall Street, right? Jews controlling Wall Street, Jews controlling the money is one of the longest anti-Semitic tropes we've had historically. And so that's a place where it does.
Thanks, Stephanie. Steve, do you think you can talk about this and also add in a little local flavor for the state of Connecticut vis-a-vis Israel?
Sure. So, there's a really, with respect to the state of Connecticut and Israel, we have good economic ties with the state of Israel. There are Israeli companies here. There's commercial exchange. There's academic exchange from UConn. There's a really good relationship between the powers that be in Connecticut and the average your average Connecticut citizen. I think that there's like a general good feeling, but we're a very diverse community with lots of different points of view. There are groups within Connecticut who are very strongly in favor of the boycott of Israel, and they, we try to have conversations. We try to have reasonable debates. It's been a very difficult challenge with respect to those groups there, but we are. I would say that by and large, our elected officials have been at the federal level, while some of them don't always agree with the policies of the Israeli government, they do see the importance and benefit to all Americans of the U.S.-Israeli relationship. They also do see that criticism of Israel can be anti-Semitic. And frankly, some of the concern that we see, and we've seen this on some campuses during my time here, and in some other communities here in Connecticut, where the acts of the state of Israel are held against Jews in America who have no say or clout over those things. Just to put a fine point on it, I know a young man, he went on a date with a woman to watch like a World Cup game. They didn't talk about Israel, but she knew he was Jewish, she was not. And then he texted her to get another date, right? And she wrote back and said, I had a nice time, but I think Bibi Netanyahu is the worst thing ever. And so I think we can't go out again. And he's like, whoa, okay. I think he smartly said something like, well, I'm not from Israel, but I guess you're saying that because I'm Jewish. By the way, I don't like Donald Trump, so I don't think we should go out again, right? When you're holding a member of a group responsible for something that is not their own beliefs, you're getting in the point of stereotyping, bias, and that was probably unconscious bias, as we talk about it here. I don't think she meant to be doing that, but it's the kind of thing that Israel is put on all Jews. And while, like Stephanie said, many Jews do identify with Israel and want to celebrate it and support it, it's not a perfect place. And so, but it's a country like any other. And so that's what I would say is, like, I do see the impact of the Israel, of its bad acts, like any country's bad acts, but being targeted at Jewish people here in America and around the world. So definitely a problem in Europe too, that the acts of Israel have made Jews in Europe and many countries feel unsafe in Europe. So.
Thanks, Steve. Avi, can you talk a little bit about the academic boycott impact with Israel?
Sure. I was going to say the guy from that story really dodged a bullet there. So, wow. Yeah, absolutely. But just, within the same vein, though, even in academia, I mean, one can offer legitimate criticism of Israel, as has been said, but just as you would any other country. But when you engage in this form of exceptional targeting, it's discriminatory, especially when you discriminate based on national origin. In the case of that story, this person who wasn't even Israeli was being held responsible for the actions of Israel, which is actually one of the 11 examples of the IRA definition. So for those less familiar with it, I encourage you to check it out and read up on it. It's worth seeing. The 11 examples don't even cover everything. There's even more permutations out there, unfortunately. But yeah, in terms of academia, I mean, I think, years ago, one of the major academic associations to adopt an academic boycott of Israel, specifically Israelis, they were targeting individuals, was the American Studies Association. And that made a lot of the news. And when the folks behind it, in the leadership, were asked why Israel, they indicated, well, you have to start somewhere. That was the line. And but they weren't just starting somewhere, they were being very targeted and they were discriminating. And I mean, the fact is that, folks can try to rationalize it, try to look past that and but anti-Semitic hate is hate. And sometimes it's presented not necessarily in intention, but definitely in effect. So, I think there's a lot of well-meaning people out there who might, through their national organizations, through their academic associations and faculty groups and whatnot, will target Israel because they feel strongly about Israeli government policies, various issues there. But when they do it to the exclusion of anything else and really go above and beyond, and also sometimes harm individuals, you're kind of stepping into a different frame that's very problematic. And that's where this notion of anti-Semitism comes from. And there have been cases where, Jewish Israeli academics have been targeted and prevented from participating in certain fora. But if one is Arab Israeli, sometimes, depends on the situation, they've gotten a pass. And then all of a sudden, you're really just discriminating against Jews now. It's not even a national origin thing. It's a identity thing. So yeah, it's messy and it's ugly. And we've seen a lot of it in the world of academia. It hasn't, and many other places, the mainline Protestant churches all over the place. But a lot of folks will try to take advantage of the platform offered them by their organizations and associations in order to land a hit on Israel, but in doing so, targeting Jews as well.
Thanks, Avi. Steve, we have a question in the chat box. I think that we'd start with you on here, since the federations as a whole go to the ADL to get our data as a rule. The question is, in 2017, the highest increase, 57% of anti-Semitic incidences were recorded, and it has not declined much since. What are some of the things that triggered this huge increase, and how do you work with communities to decrease the incidence?
Thanks. Great question. Yeah, that's right. The numbers have sort of stayed steady since that big jump up happened. The way we collect the incidents is it's a year-long process where ADL's offices, we've got about 25 offices around the country. I think we have 25, and then we have one in Israel and one in Europe. We collect the incidents. Some of it's through people reporting to us, some we see in the media, and many come from law enforcement when they're of a criminal nature. Just to give a sense, a lot in Connecticut, many of the incidents are school-based. They are, K through 12 schools, sometimes college campuses. What we're doing there's multiple fronts on which we're trying to help bring that number back down. By the way, we attribute the rise. I'm reluctant to say that it was just President Trump, okay? But the number of incidents that were reported did jump during the summer of 2016 and that campaign. There was something about the nature of his campaign that what used the word emboldened, sort of possibly, made people feel more comfortable to express biased views, not just against Jews, but against many groups, and people who had those views were less inhibited. Listen, ADL we're a civil rights group. We defend the right of free speech, and we don't want the government to be able to censor it. But the reason that I said earlier that this has been the best place and time for Jews in the world, possibly in our entire existence, is because we've protected the right to free speech and the right to practice religion, but society has stood up and said, if you're going to be a racist, or you're going to be anti-Semitic, or you're going to be judging people based on a group that they're in, there will be a social, financial, or other consequence for you. It won't go so well for you at work. It won't be so great for your kids if you're talking as a racist in town, right? There was a social stigma associated with, and a shame that came with it. And that shame has reduced. We've also seen many people feeling much more scared because of that, and possibly reporting a lot of things that were always happening that they never felt they needed to report, or they never, and so we take anonymous complaints. And then what do we do to handle it? It really, as I said, it really depends on the nature of the complaint. If it's a kid, there's a 5th grader in Fairfield County who stood up and gave a Heil Hitler salute. We're not going to call for expulsion and ride them out of town on a rail. We're gonna work with the school and the parents and say, hey, how can we make this a learning experience? Help the students and families who had to witness it and deal with it. But how do we deal with it? When it's in politics, not as much forgiveness. When we've seen, when there was a guy running for a state senator who just got reelected, had a QAnon bumper sticker on his car. Okay. That's not a time where we're going to say, okay, hey, how do we talk about this? We're going to criticize him loud and hopefully get him to understand and apologize, which he did. When it's at the communal level, we're really looking for elected leaders to take their charges. Earlier this year, there was a woman, I think it was in Stratford, who was being harassed, and we were working with her. There was someone repeatedly texting her and threatening her, and the FBI arrested her. Right, so there's really a wide range of punishment and discipline, all the way to education and trying to stop the hate before it starts. So, it's because it manifests in so many different ways, because there's certain people who don't have any intent to be anti-Semitic, we will deal with them different than the others. And so happy to talk more about that later, but it's a lot of various ways that we deal with it.
Thanks, Steve. It's a big question. I want to sort of push that on a little bit to Stephanie and talk a little bit about the political arena. You're a former council person yourself, but in recent years, both political parties have politicized anti-Semitism, and each has accused the other party of being inhospitable to Jews, and all too rarely does anybody take responsibility for anti-Semitism in their own ranks. To what degree did this happen in this current election cycle? And did we do anything as Jews to stop it? And if you can, I want to incorporate one of the questions from the chat box, which is, to what extent is QAnon anti-Semitic, and how popular actually is it?
Okay.
Big.
So just to start, also in 2017, I guess I'll start a little bit there, but none of this is new, right? And so I would say that I was as Carin mentioned, I was a city councilwoman that was a victim, I guess, of anti-Semitic attacks consistently. Part of that was maybe a little bit about the unique nature of Rockland County, which some of you might be aware of, some of you might not, and the large Hasidic population and the impact that has on some of the dialogue around the community. And I took a very strong stance that I wouldn't tolerate anti-Semitic slurs directed towards any part of the Jewish community. And so I faced flack for that. And was told by the person sitting next to me on the city council that I should go back to my synagogue and talk to them about swastikas when we found swastikas in the town that were not brought to the attention of the whole board. And so having that experience has certainly given me a unique space in this. But in 2017, we also saw Charlottesville, the march in Charlottesville. And we saw that, and Steve just mentioned this, but people who were long in the shadows. And in my personal experience, I felt this. And one day someone said, oh, we're going to start looking like New York City and the Bronx over here. Like, we moved to this suburb for a reason. And like, okay, coded word. They were talking about the street the JCC was on. So like, let's think about what they're talking about. Okay, fine. But when we saw the march in Charlottesville, and we saw people literally saying, and people that had been tracked by organizations, right, for years as white supremacists, but saying Jews will not replace us. I think for many in America, and I think this relates to what Steve is talking about in terms of people increasing reporting incidences, for many in America, Jews and non-Jews, it was the first time in their lifetime, or in a very long time, that they had seen Jews being called out in such a public way. And that particular moment also brought more people outside of the shadows, because they saw, frankly, that not much happened to them, right? You have a right to free speech, you have a right to say whatever you want. And so we've seen more and more of these types of protests. We've seen more and more of white supremacy on the rise. But the unfortunate piece is that, and Carin, you said this, is that we see anti-Semitism on both sides of the political aisle, right? We've had instances with Democratic lawmakers. We've had instances with Republican lawmakers. We have had instances, I think, right here in Connecticut, where if I remember when Matt Lesser was running, and I can't remember if it was this time or last time, one of his opponents took a kind of doctored photo of him and we saw, made him look like a very large nose and controlled money. And we saw something similar with John Ossoff in this election, right? And we've seen it before. This wasn't the first year we saw it. We first see it in 2016, but certainly there's been a rise of it. The biggest problem that we see as Jewish federations who work very, very hard to maintain bipartisan support for Israel, but also bipartisan support against anti-Semitism, is that we don't often enough see people calling out those on their side of the aisle who are making anti-Semitic remarks. And it shouldn't be up to a few Jewish members of Congress or a few Jewish legislators to call out the bad behavior. And we need to see leadership from, there's been a lack of leadership, I would say, in both Speaker Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy when it comes to certain members of their congressional delegations, and we've seen it in state houses as well, is that we need to call out anti-Semitism for what it is. Just like we would call out, right, anything else, but we need to call it out and we need to say this is anti-Semitic and there needs to be consequences. The Republicans actually, this took years and years and years, but Congressman Steve King from Iowa was finally stripped of all of his, he lost now, but it was finally stripped of all of his committee assignments, right? It took years. And the question was he stripped of it because they really felt like finally what he did was over the line, or they were trying to send a message to Democrats that they should do similarly with their member, right? And it becomes, we live in such polarized political times, and anti-Semitism, often become a scapegoat when there's any times of uncertainty. We often see an increase of anti-Semitism when there's uncertainty, economic uncertainty, a pandemic, right? And that's throughout history. And unfortunately, we see it within the Jewish community. There are right-wing organizations and left-wing organizations in the Jewish community that only want to call out anti-Semitism and their right. White supremacy is responsible for all anti-Semitism in America. No, it's not. It might be responsible for violent anti-Semitism in America, and we don't often see left-wing violent anti-Semitism, but there is left-wing anti-Semitism. Some of it might not be as clear to name, but it exists. And so what we push for is that people speak up. We want others to help kind of speak up on behalf of the Jewish community, that Jews always being the ones to call it out. Sometimes it creates a situation where people may not believe it as much, right? But when we have people who are able to say, no, this is wrong and that's anti-Semitic and I'm gonna call it out even if it's in my group, that's a much stronger case. And we saw that actually a few months ago in Philadelphia in the NAACP, where an NAACP leader over several years had made a lot of anti-Semitic statements. Finally, it was kind of a last straw moment. And the other leaders of the NAACP and local church leaders and local legislators, both Jewish and Black, worked together to try to heal the divides within the community after that situation.
Thanks. Avi, can you address the part of the question that came from the chat box? To what extent is QAnon anti-Semitic, and how popular actually is it?
Yeah, I'm no QAnon expert, but I would say, and I kind of alluded to this before about the other question from the chat box, it has been drawing a lot on classic anti-Semitic tropes and ideas and theories, but then applying it outside of of Jews, going out, not targeting Jews necessarily, but drawing on it. It's almost as if kind of it was workshopped. All these classic, very powerful anti-Semitic theories and ideas were workshopped for, millennia on Jews, and now are being employed beyond. And I would say, we just saw with the election, we have somebody who's a supporter of QAnon get elected. It's power. It has certain power with some people. It's still fringe, I would hope, but there's the danger of it being more mainstreamed. And I would just say that, we saw in this past election cycle, if I can say past, we saw vilification of Jewish figures like George Soros and Michael Bloomberg, Bernie Sanders, often tying in anti-Semitic tropes or conspiracy theories, targeting them. Stephanie mentioned John Ossoff as well, and his nose was stretched out in a poster. And then there's the mainstreaming of QAnon and the Jewish conspiracy theories that come with it. That in and of itself is highly problematic. I would also just say, again, as has been said by my colleagues, it's really, there are issues and anti-Semitism on both sides, in the sense that, on the left, I don't think it's as much active anti-Semitism as we've seen intentionally overlooking notable elements of anti-Semitism creeping in into much needed, important conversations about civil rights and race. There's the Farrakhan Nation of Islam component. It's been a stain and a distraction. The failure to condemn the use of anti-Semitic tropes by some figures in the more progressive flank. And so, Jews are kind of taking it from both sides, and QAnon is kind of like a whole other, it's its own world. There's if you read up on it, it's like going down the rabbit hole. It's some pretty loopy stuff. And I've seen the bumper stickers, when I'm on the road, there are people out there who support it. So it's dangerous. We got to keep our eyes on it.
Thank you, Avi. Steve,
I can just add
for a second, Steve, and this is to you, actually. Something that Stephanie talked about, and something you and I talked about, I think this afternoon or yesterday afternoon, about the relationship between African Americans and Jews as far as civil rights and calling out racism and calling out anti-Semitism. Can you talk a little bit about that? I realize we weren't planning on going down that road, but it's been brought up already. Are Jews the only ones who are supposed to be calling out anti-Semitism?
No, I think the answer to that is obviously a rhetorical question. I think, I think, what the Jewish people would hope is that Jews and others would call out anti-Semitism, and what is incumbent upon the Jewish community is to call out racism and call out other attacks on groups of people. And that's been sort of the mission of our organization for over 100 years, is to fight anti-Semitism and secure justice for all. I would say that before I get to the question about the relationship between the Jewish community and the African American community, I just want to say quickly, with respect to QAnon and anti-Semitism, there's very obvious, the Q theory. Q is the guy who started QAnon. I think he's still anonymous, but very clear anti-Semitism. Many of the themes throughout the QAnon conspiracy theories are based on anti-Semitic tropes. Q has specifically dropped things that are images of Jews, holding a knife with blood, and they're very clearly anti-Semitic. And so it's also goes against many groups, but there's no question there's deep anti-Semitism in that group. And what I would say is the challenge at this moment with respect, the Black community, the Jewish community in America have historically really been, even though our situations of coming to this country started off very different, and even though in many ways there have been, as a general rule, sort of different economic situations meeting our communities, I think there's a moment, but since the civil rights movement began, the Jewish community, there were rabbis walking arm in arm with Dr. King across the bridge in Selma. There are, the Jewish community votes by and large alongside the African-American community in elections, and not just for that reason, but they tend to be in lockstep. My organization has been pushing for, we wrote an amicus brief in Brown versus Board of Education. Like there's a very long history. At this time in America, there are many things that the Jewish community and African-American community are in lockstep on. The push for social and racial justice, criminal justice. There are, many Jewish organizations, including ours, putting a ton of resources into making sure that we address systemic racism, that we address the real disadvantages that are facing African-American communities of color. My organization works every day with law enforcement. We do it to keep people safe, and we provide them with information about extremist groups and hate crimes, and we deal with them on their own bias and racism within law enforcement. And so we are, we are sort of, and we're pushing, right? We're pushing for civil rights, and we're working with law enforcement. That's in some ways how the Jewish community is. We want law enforcement to be doing good work, keeping everybody safe. And we want them to make sure that they're dealing with their own racism that they're bringing to their work. So it's complicated. It has also been complicated by the fact, particularly in New York City and in the New York suburbs, of attacks on Jewish people by individuals who are African American. And there has been a lot of tension. The end of 2019, around this time and into December, there were a series of attacks, some which wound up being were murders in Jersey City, in Brooklyn, in Muncie, in New York. And so those things will strain relationships. And so what we need to do is come together and talk about the real problems, identify the individuals who are getting the wrong message, taking the wrong actions. And we're doing that work. I mean, the partnership that ADL has with NAACP, Urban League around the country, we're out there and doing that work to help the Black community and to fight anti-Semitism. But it's a challenge. I'd be lying if I said it weren't. But I think that the ties that bind us are much stronger than the individuals that are seeing each other as enemies. So
thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Stephanie, I actually want to take it back to you. There seems to be a question. I think it is directed at you. They're talking about intersectionality between gender and being Jewish. And does one gender encounter greater discrimination, especially in public figures like you were as a council person?
Well, being we are speaking for, I think, a mostly female or certainly a women-sponsored event, I would like to take this. We did see a lot of issues around intersectionality and gender with the Women's March. And so we had Jewish women who came out in droves and buses to participate in the Women's March the first time it happened. And then we saw some clear anti-Semitism from the Women's March leadership on the national level that caused a sense that it wasn't a welcoming place for all Jewish voices. And then it took a couple of different tolls. There was some larger issues within the Women's March, and so there were separate sister marches that weren't necessarily attached to the national march. And then for I think the third year, I remember the second or third year, there was a real effort on behalf of, we had many Federation leaders who had participated in the Women's March and who had been active and involved, talked to their local march leaders and talked to them about some of the anti-Semitism that we were seeing from the leadership and whether they can ensure that it would be a safe, inclusive space for all. And so those conversations took place, and a lot of it was eye-opening to the people that they were talking with. It also involved a lot of cooperative work and learning together after those conversations and after those local marches. But then what we saw in the kind of third year of the Women's March is they kind of replaced some of the leadership And they picked a few Jewish women to be on the steering committee. And then they also decided to lead the march with Jewish women of color and a particular organization that was the led meaning of Jewish women of color, which was extraordinary that they were acknowledging that there are many in our Jewish community who are also women of color and that they have intersectional identities. But it also seemed to be a little bit of picking which Jewish women can sit at the table and which Jewish women cannot sit at the table. And I think sometimes, particularly in progressive spaces, that's felt a lot by Jewish women who tend to be, I mean, when you look at exit polls, who tend to be pretty democratic, pretty left-leaning, who have been engaged in a lot of this work for a long period of time and are starting to see themselves as the only Jewish woman at the table, not being validated in some of their mainly progressive agenda because they also support Israel. And so that's been, I think, a rising challenge. Whether there's like a gendered issue within Judaism and intersectionality, I think one of the other pieces to that, and this is maybe a little bit more in the weeds, is, and this was also something I experienced personally, was that there are gendered things within Judaism, right? And depending on your Jewish practice level, right? So I go to a modern Orthodox synagogue, and so women and men sit separately, right? That's how it is at the synagogue that I go to. And there are some things that women do, and there are some things that men do, and that's the community that I belong in. I grew up in a conservative synagogue where women and men did mostly the same things and sat together. There's a lot of use of Jewish practice and others telling Jewish women what is something that is not feminist, right? I personally think I'm a feminist. I personally see no issue with my religious observance or how I practice religion or where I practice my Judaism and my feminist ideals. And I have seen from others calling into question whether all Jewish women can be in certain spaces and should people's religious affiliation or religious practice be part of it. And again, it's like very kind of insider thing, and it may be more of an issue in the New York area than it probably is in other areas where there's, you know, a lot less difference in practice. But I think sometimes people will take Jewish law and say, well, you can't do this. And we don't tend to do that with other religions and say, well, this practice you do is weird, so we're going to call you out for that practice, right? And so I don't know, it's a unique thing perhaps, but I thought worthy of mentioning.
Thank you, Stephanie. I actually want to sort of further a little bit with you, Avi, and talk a little bit about Jews and the coronavirus. Blaming Jews for pandemics is literally as old as time. We've been accused of spreading infection, intentionally poisoning society, and even getting rich at the expense of others. Today, Orthodox Jews have been in the spotlight, accused of spreading the coronavirus. Some say it's because they're an easy target, they're easy to identify, and they're hard to defend. It's not anti-Semitic to acknowledge the high infection rates, but is it anti-Semitic to single one group out?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I was just gonna, before I even answer it though, just kind of throw in something to what Stephanie was just saying, and related to COVID actually. Because of the current restrictions right now, you can only have 10 people. The newest restrictions that just came out, at least in New York State. I don't know about Connecticut. The idea of only having 10 people at a gathering. And then as a result of that, quorum for a religious prayer, Jewish religious prayer, Orthodox prayer at least, is 10. Usually it's in Orthodoxy is 10 men. So as a result, women are actually getting pushed out of prayer spaces left and right or everywhere. So it creates this additional exclusion. It's really problematic. But regarding COVID, yeah, I mean, holding Jewish communities to a standard to which you would not hold anyone else, differential treatment, that would be anti-Semitic. But if a particular community in a particular area is experiencing high infection rates and other communities are similarly doing so, but you single out one while not offering resources in their own language, and you unilaterally shut down their places of worship without first attempting to create accommodations or engage in dialogue, that's a problem. But that said, some ultra-Orthodox communities, which themselves are internally diverse, have significant cross-sections that have engaged in irresponsible behavior, much of which we've seen in the news, and surrounding the virus. And it's a public health issue, and it must be addressed. But if done equitably, with good intentions, it need not be considered anti-Semitic. So it really depends on how it's approached and how it's manifested. I said earlier, context is key. I mean, definitely in this case, it is.
Okay, thank you. Steve, did you want to talk about that at all?
I just wanted to add, just one example, not here in the U.S., but I don't know if you saw the other day, right? Pfizer announced some great news about their coronavirus vaccine, and in Greece, a Greek tabloid, because the CEO of Pfizer is a Jewish man, a Greek tabloid compared him to Nazi Joseph Mengele for wanting to conduct hideous experiments. So, whether we're blamed for the virus or blamed for trying to monetize the cure for the virus, we saw a ton of this right when it started hitting the U.S. We saw a lot of conspiracy theories about how the Jews were manipulating this. It has been, in addition to obviously blaming the Asian American community, which is another targeted group. But it's really that's the thing with this anti-Semitism, right? Where either the Jew is either all powerful or a termite, or right? It's whatever you want to attack. You can always find a way to blame it on the Jew, and that's really what we're trying to combat. And it's an everyday challenge. So.
Okay, thank you. Steve, there's another question in the chat box about Parler. And I know that you sent out, and if you're not reading the chat box, folks, there's a lot of links in there, useful links, ADL statistics in there. Stephanie posted the definition of anti-Semitism, but can you speak to a little bit how I guess, what we're seeing? I mean, the rise of anti-Semitism on Parler, for example.
Yeah. So I don't think it's just anti-Semitism on Parler. What we're seeing on Parler, and I'm just catching up on this one. So ADL has a National Center on Extremism where we have investigators who are, really in kind of cloak and dagger kind of way, sort of living in the private chat rooms of real violent extremists. We work a lot with law enforcement to make sure that we can prevent crime or respond after something's happened with evidence of whether a crime was motivated by hate. And our investigators have been tracking recently a flocking of people to Parler. Now, so Parler has been a place that's rife with anti-Semitic and racist conspiracy theories. And it was a kind of a smaller player, but in the wake of the election and the results of the election, there has been a large millions of as far as we can tell, conservative thinking Americans who have lost faith in the mainstream media, and they are being pushed to Parler as a place to get their information. And so what you'll see in this report is there's become like a mingling of mainstream Americans with, conservative leanings who are not extremists or racists or anti-Semites in any real way, now finding themselves more comfortable in a place that is feeding really biased views and false narratives. And so we're very concerned about Parler. I encourage you to read the report. It's on our website, but I'm just catching up myself, so I don't want to go too deep into it and sound like I'm an expert where I'm not. So,
Okay. Thanks. Anybody have anything to add on that?
I was gonna call the ADL and ask them. So whatever Steve posted is probably what I would say.
So this is kind of difficult. You know, one of the great tensions in the Jewish world is whether we should be willing to engage people who are anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic, or who cavort with, you know, known anti-Semites, such as Louis Farrakhan. Some people say that doing so gives anti-Semites legitimacy, and others say if we don't engage them, we will be absent ourselves from the critical tables and lose influence. Well, what do you think? The question is to all of you, whoever wants to start.
So I'll start just because I saw a somewhat semi-public-private fight about this week, and I thought I would use it as an example. Nick Cannon this summer posted, it was an Instagram post, a meme, it was a Farrakhan quote, anti-Semitic quote. And so the way the Jewish community responded though was interesting, right? And the way a lot of people responded, right? So he got fired from one job. And then at the same time, the Jewish community, multiple people reached out to him to have conversations. Malcolm Homeline, who is actually, I'm not even sure what his title is right now, but is the maybe CEO emeritus of the Conference of Presidents of American Jewish Organizations, had him over.
He's still the head. He's still the head.
Oh, okay. Had him over for Shabbat dinner and had quite the conversation with him, and has done an education with him on Nation of Islam, on Louis Farrakhan, on where some of these beliefs come from, and to get a better understanding of where he's coming from. He's getting a doctorate in theology, right? He's not someone that's not smart, right? Like he's someone that is really asking inquisitive questions. And someone else said in this conversation I was listening to, said we shouldn't engage with him because he said X, Y, and Z, and I don't remember exactly what this person was saying. He said X, Y, and Z, and that's the red line. And Malcolm actually pushed back and said, you know, actually, if we don't give people the opportunity, if we don't do, and a lot of the work we do at federations through community relations, a lot of the work ADL does and other Jewish organizations in terms of really working with diverse communities in our local communities and nationally, is on the premise that that there's always work to be done, and that we can, and some people there's not, right? Like there are probably a few people in the world, and Steve mentioned 10 to 15% of the country, and they're anti-Semitic, and even maybe among that there might be some people that might be worth having the conversation. We see every so often former neo-Nazis you know, are now doing trainings on anti-Semitism with the Wiesenthal Center because they saw the light, right? So it's possible. And so I think the way in which the Jewish community reacted to some of these instances over the summer with athletes and celebrities was to engage in conversation, to engage in understanding. Because Jewish communities, we have 146 Jewish federations across the United States and Canada, 300 smaller communities, but we're not everywhere. And not every American has experience with Jews, right? I went to college and my college roommate had never met a Jewish person before. And she didn't know I was Jewish because my name could be German or Austrian, which my family was from Austria. And so it was a cultural shock, right? And she said some really offensive things in the first week of school that also happened to be Rosh Hashanah, which was, you know, one of our biggest holidays. And it was a little bit of an awakening for both of us. But ultimately, second semester, she joined the Jewish a cappella group, right? Like it wasn't because she didn't like Jews. It was because she just didn't know. And then she really liked Jews. But, you know, I think that we have an obligation to educate people and to give people a little bit of the benefit of the doubt that they're not coming from a bad place and that we should engage. And if engagement doesn't work and education doesn't work, then okay, then we can draw a red line, but that we should start with the conversation. I think some of the work some of our organizations have done, or at least some of our organizations have done with the activists that might be part of Black Lives Matter or Movement for Black Lives even. There are some troubling things in the Movement for Black Lives platform. Most of it's not. Most of it's about criminal justice and the need for racial justice and systematic reforms, most of which we agree with. But we chose to engage with individuals and have real conversations instead of writing off an entire group because of something in the platform. I know it's a horrible thing in the platform, and I'm not trying to diminish it, but sometimes we need to be able to engage with people and have conversations because really we move the needle. We don't move the needle online. We don't move the needle in large statements. We move the needle by one-on-one conversations.
Thanks, Tiffany. Avi?
Yeah, I would just say that it kind of depends on if you have to assess. Yeah, you have to see if there's an opening, when it comes to like just talking celebrities, 'cause it's fun. Mel Gibson, he's a repeat offender. He's raised by an anti-Semitic father. He can apologize all he wants, but there's a level of unrepentance there. And it's not the Jewish community's responsibility to forgive him or try to absolve him of that. But then you've got other folks over the past several months, Stephanie mentioned Nick Cannon, but like Deshaun Jackson, people who didn't necessarily know a lot about historical anti-Semitism, posted some content online that was hateful, might have even doubled down on it, but then proceeded to sincerely apologize, work on making amends, and actually work on themselves to learn more about the issues and understand. So if there's an opportunity to turn something ugly into a nice teachable moment, absolutely. But at the same time, if your resources are limited as an advocate, it's smart to focus on, the audience you can influence and move and not necessarily those that are locked into a particular mindset. So it's important to assess whether there is that opening there, because if there isn't, you of course also don't want to waste your time. Yeah.
Thanks. Steve, I just want to add an element in here because they both have raised this in there. To what degree does the Jewish community accept or even cultivate the apologies of celebrities and athletes who've come out with anti-Semitic statements?
What can you explain what you mean by cultivate?
Well, I just heard it from Avi. I mean,
Yeah.
we have no obligation to forgive Mel Gibson. I mean, do we never go to a Mel Gibson movie again? I mean, I don't know what it looks like to different people, but what responsibility do we have publicly to say that an apology is no good here?
I think Avi sort of said there's like a pattern of practice, right? It's like are you repentant? And this is an approach we take with the kids in school all the way to the, former white supremacists. Like, what is that? If we're talking about an individual, what is their personal motivation, their mindset? What are they willing to do next? And actually for me, probably the most inspiring example of the forgiveness that I've seen in this work was not within the Jewish community, but in the Muslim community. In Connecticut, in Cheshire, I think it was 2015 or 16, there was someone shot a gun at a mosque. Didn't hit anybody, but really it was a very, very scary moment. They found the person. He wound up going to prison, and the members of the Ahmadiyya Mosque visited him in prison every week, and got to know him, and he got to know them, and he is now a spokesman against the kind of hate that he really took to heart. And for me, so I'm one of those people also, Steph, I spend time with former white supremacists and extremists because we bring them to schools to talk to kids, and they can be very powerful advocates. Those who have seen what they did wrong or what they were thinking was wrong, and can sort of explain how they got that perspective and what made them change. Some of the and people to sort of prevent that type of behavior and thinking in others. former white supremacists also tend to be a little nuts. I got to be honest. I mean, they're really, you know, they are definitely, there's large ego. You know, it's quite an experience to be with them, but they are very powerful advocates. And one of the people who I work the closest with is a former member of the Westboro Baptist Church, which I don't know, they're kind of like a cult. They're the ones who picket military funerals, the one who say, you know, I'm going to use horrible language, but like, God hates fags. God, you know, your rabbi is a whore. Like really, really offensive stuff. They're out of Topeka, Kansas, but they travel the country. They win First Amendment cases at the Supreme Court. Megan Phelps Roper grew up in the family. It is her family, and she has left the family and has been an amazing sort of ally with ADL, telling her story. I think the power of us to forgive when we can do it is right. But I will also say that after not just Charlottesville, but the attack in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue, the attack in Poway there, there's a real fear among the Jewish community here in America and around the world now that wasn't there in the same way before. And so fear will make us afraid to forgive. And so it takes a strength that we need to find. So.
Thank you. So we don't have a lot of time left, just a few minutes, but I can't help but note, and I've gotten a couple of private chats about this. All of us, all four of us, have very powerful organizations behind us, Jewish organizations behind us. I know at our Federation in Eastern Connecticut, we run the Encountering Survivors program that fights Holocaust denial at the high school level. But the questions that I'm getting is, now that we've spent this time defining anti-Semitism and sort of, and to some extent, even rationalizing its existence, you know, what are we supposed to do individually? What can you tell the people who are listening tonight individually? What can we do if we see it, if we hear it, if we come in contact with it, whether we're Jewish or not? And Avi, I'm going to start with you, and we've got about 4 minutes total. You're muted.
There we go. Hi, sorry. What can we do? I mean, number one, if you're not completely, don't have a complete you know, a very strong understanding of anti-Semitism, and you recognize that, learn more about it yourself before you can then teach others. Another thing is just be engaged, be involved with, you know, with organizations near you, around you, people who can connect you with resources and information. You know, ADL, JFNA, Israel Action Network, CAM, we all have a lot to offer. And then, of course, there's also, you know, think globally, act locally. Think about what you can do near you to make a difference, whether it's just, you know, taking part in a campaign, working on you know, running a panel like this in your local community to get people to be more engaged on the issues. I mean, I think there's a lot of small practical things that people can do, and that's important, every little bit. And of course, also advocating. We started this program with the IRA definition, which is just so important. So advocating for local leadership to consider adopting it and endorsing it, so that we can continue to have this shared understanding of what this hate is and what it looks like.
Thanks. Stephanie?
So I would say, I don't want to be repetitive, so I would say call it out, right? It's like one of the, you know, if you see something, say something, right? Department of Homeland Security. Oftentimes I think, you know, and this goes for everything, and I think we all need to call out racism more, we need to call out sexism, we need to call out, right, not just anti-Semitism, but certainly that if you see anti-Semitism, or even if you see something that you think could be anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic in nature, to have a conversation with the person saying it. And I would also say to think about, you know, we've been doing a lot of thinking about diversity in our Jewish spaces, and what it means to be diverse what it means to be inclusive of the entire Jewish community, right? Jews of color, disabled Jews, gender parity, right? And what that means. But I would also say that as you're involved in different spaces in your community, to think about, and it might not be like so obvious, right? Jews don't all look the same. And we're actually trying to encourage people that Jews don't all look the same, and we have many different backgrounds and upbringings. But to think about if there are Jews in that space, and if there aren't, why not? And if there are people that used to come around, why aren't they coming around anymore? And I particularly say this about more left-leaning and progressive spaces where I think people have felt a tension and challenge over the last several years. So I would say inclusivity, and also to think about when talking about hate, to also talk about anti-Semitism, and to talk through it so that people understand we as Jews also need to listen and hear from other communities about the challenges they face. And together, and I know someone wrote a comment or question about this, together that we can fight some of these hateful forces that exist, unfortunately, in our society.
Thanks, Stephanie. And Steve, final remarks from you?
Sure. Well, I thank you, Avi and Stephanie. Those are great recommendations. You covered most of everything I would have said, but I think the one thing I would add is, when you're in that moment and you maybe hear something that sounds like it could be anti-Semitic, or frankly, racist or whatever, the thing that I have found that we recommend is, the best way to sort of open up that conversation and have a chance to change some hearts and minds, or at least understand what was said, is to ask a question. It's probably best not to attack someone or call someone out that way. I think it's important to have that conversation if you have the right relationship, but be careful as you do it. And usually like saying something like, "What do you mean by that?" or "I don't get that," or "Huh?" Right? For students in schools, we say, if someone says something anti-Semitic, we tell the kids to say "ouch," right? But something like a question tends to open up a dialogue that can lead toward progress, and you'll probably learn something yourself too. So that would be my last point.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming and talking about this very important topic. And Denise, I'm going to turn it back over to you. It's been a very informative evening for everyone. Thank you. Please help me thank our panelists tonight.
Well, thank you, Carin, Stephanie, Avi, and Steve. It was wonderful. I really appreciate your panel tonight. It was very informative and very eye-opening. So thank you very much for taking the time to speak and let us hear you. And for everyone else, thank you for joining us. And you can learn more about the rest of our Unconscious Bias series at southeasternconnecticutwomen.org, SECTWN.org.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
very
you
much.
all.
Thanks. Thank
Good
you
night.
very much.